Hello there, I'm a nerd named Ryan, and in today's video we are going to be talking about this, Dracula from 1958, also known as Horror of Dracula in the United States. One of the best horror movies of all time. I love this movie, so let's talk about it. Okay, so Dracula from 1958. This, of course, was produced by Hammer off the success of their Frankenstein adaptation, Curse of Frankenstein. And it features a lot of the same people who were involved in that film, director Terence Fisher, and stars Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. Now, no disrespect to the 1930s Universal version of Dracula with Bela Lugosi, that's iconic in its own right, but for me, this is the definitive film version of Dracula. I love this movie. I think it just does so much right. I think it does so many things well. And yeah, for me, it holds up really, really well, and it is the definitive version of Dracula. Now, I will say, if you like your film adaptations to be, completely 100% accurate and faithful to the book, this isn't going to be the film for you. Hammer basically made films on quite modest budgets, so writer Jimmy Sangster really had to kind of be very economical with the story for his screenplay. He had to sort of pare it down a bit, cut costs and stuff like that, and also cut for time, because, this is an 82-minute film. You're not going to be able to tell everything that happens in Dracula in 82 minutes. But what I think is brilliant about Sangster's screenplay here is that while it does cut out bits of the novel, while it takes liberties with the story of the novel, it keeps the essence of Dracula. It keeps the essence of Bram Stoker's original novel, that kind of spooky, tense, gothic atmosphere is still alive. The, horrific, animalistic portrayal of Dracula is still there. And yeah, it keeps a lot of the essence of Dracula without having to adapt it completely and faithfully. And I think that's a really big strength of the movie, is that screenplay by Jimmy Sangster, who even manages to sneak in a few bits of comedy here and there, particularly in the scene where Van Helsing and Arthur Holm will go and visit the Undertaker. That's a really great little, a nice little bit of comic relief in an otherwise very dark and gothic film. So yeah, the way the screenplay kind of, keeps the essence of Dracula and keeps the gothic feel of the story, whilst also, kind of cutting bits out and making it a very economical film so they can tell it really cheaply and in a 82 minutes. Really is a great strength movie. I think Jimmy Sangster did a wonderful job there. Another way in which this kind of keeps the feel of Dracula, keeps the feel of the original novel, is in the way that it looks, the way that it's shot, the way that it's filmed, and the way that it is designed. You have cinematographer Jack Asher, who's, as a director of photography, he was never sort of massively overly flashy, but he really does make use of the fact that Hammer were shooting films in colour. By the way, that's another great selling point for this film, is that all of the blood is in colour, and it's so, it's bright, almost like red paint, the blood in these movies. Hammer really kind of took advantage of the fact that they were making films in colour. So the technical is a great aspect as well. And Jack Asher, as a cinematographer, really uses that to his advantage. You've got a lot of warm lighting and colours in the, with our human protagonists. But then you also have a very sort of cold and dark and creepy atmosphere to Dracula's castle. The castle is not barren. The castle is very well furnished and very inviting. But the way that it's shot gives it this kind of ominous, eerie presence to it. I mean, that eeriness kind of runs throughout the movie, even right at the start. The opening title, as you get that great opening score, that very dramatic, dark score blaring through as we see, the outline of that statue on the castle, and then we go down into the crypt and we see the Dracula's coffin and little bits of blood dripping out. It's such a brilliant, iconic opening sequence that really kind of sets the tone for the gothic eeriness of the rest of the movie. James Bernard, who composed the score, and really does a brilliant job. There are bits in the film where there's just ever so slight, very subtle little bits of strings, to really kind of amp up the tension. And then whenever you see kind of Dracula, there's always a big kind of blare of noise, like a big dramatic, really creepy gothic orchestral score that really works brilliantly. So yeah, I think he does a lot of heavy lifting in this film, does James Bernard, with his score. It's a really excellent score. Another really great sort of unsung hero of Hammer, who does a great job here, is production designer Bernard Russell. Now again, much like James Bernard and Terence Fisher and Jimmy Sangster as well, he would sort of work on a lot of Hammer movies. And what was brilliant about Bernard Robinson was that he could make a set look big and lavish and expensive, but he could do it really cheaply. So a lot of Hammer movies look a lot more extravagant and a lot more expensive than they really are, and Dracula is no exception to that. You know, he uses the same set a few different times here, just sort of redressed, and when you watch the movie, you can barely tell. Like, unless you're really looking for it, you can't really tell. That's how good he was at this, and it gives the it gives the movie a very kind of grand feel. It looks very big, it looks very lavish, it looks very expensive, but he could do it on the cheap. And really, you know, Bernard Robinson, a real unsung hero of Hammer movies for me. But of course, we got to get to the main sort of points of this movie that I really love. First off, Terence Fisher, masterful director. Terence Fisher was originally an editor, and so he knows how to pace a film pretty much perfectly, and this is a brilliantly paced movie. You know, it's only 82 minutes. They tell a lot of story in 82 minutes, and yet none of it feels rushed. You know, we take our time with certain aspects. We get to know the characters, we get to feel for the characters, we get to really like the characters, and that's a real strength of Terence Fisher's, that he would kind of carry through his entire run on Hammer. He's one of the best directors in Hammer's history, one of the sort of best regarded directors in Hammer's history, and he does a brilliant job here. You know, every shot, every set piece, every scene is very deliberately done, very deliberately staged, and it's so brilliantly directed. It is a masterfully directed horror film. Just a great film in general. One of the finest horror movies ever made. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the two great lead actors at the centre of it. We have Christopher Lee as, for me, the best version of Dracula. I love what Christopher Lee does with the character in this movie. You know, I think a lot of versions of Dracula tend to romanticize Dracula. They make him a very sort of charming and almost romantic figure. Christopher Lee kind of opts to not do that in this film. Like, at the start, you know, he has the little bit of dialogue with Jonathan Harker, which is actually Christopher Lee's only dialogue in the film. And he kind of has this facade of being a sort of charming gentleman that he puts on for Harker to lull him into a false sense of security. But from his second appearance onwards, we see Dracula as this monster, this animal that he is. You know, the almost sort of like an animalistic predator, just hunting his prey all the time, stalking his prey, and that's all down to Christopher Lee's brilliant performance. Again, he says basically nothing in the film apart from in that first scene, but it's the way he stands, it's the way he holds himself, it's the way he walks towards the camera slowly, bathed in the dark shadow. It's so brilliantly done. And I think what I love in the movie is the build-up to Dracula in the first act, where we see Jonathan Harker first arriving at the castle. You know, the first person he encounters is Dracula's bride, who, you know, begs him to help her escape from Dracula's castle. And then we see Dracula stood atop the stairs with the music, you know, kind of swelling around him in basically a silhouette. You just see like his silhouette. He's got the long cape on, and he just very slowly walks down the stairs towards Harker and towards the camera. And it's even that's when he's, you know, in putting on his facade of being charming. And even then, it's got that kind of unsettling feel to it. And it all builds beautifully in the next couple of scenes, right up until we see that moment and that great close-up of him with the red eyes and the fangs with blood dripping off them. And it's so simple, you know, it's such a simple look for Dracula. You know, it's just Christopher Lee with red eyes and fangs with a bit of blood on. But the way that it's shot, the way that it kind of goes from seeing him kind of far away in the doorway, right up to just the massive close-up of the face, the iconic close-up of his face. It's masterful storytelling. It's wonderful. Again, it's great directing from Terence Fisher. Brilliantly done, scene layout there. But as just Christopher Lee's face, just the way he kind of just grins at the camera, he just sort of goes, ah, and it's just great. It's so good. And from then on, you see the sort of the true version of Dracula, what he really is. This monster, just always kind of lurking in the shadows. As much as it is Terence Fisher's, scene layout and everything like that, and as much as the makeup helps, a lot of it is Christopher Lee and the physicality that he plays Dracula with. He plays Dracula as a monster. He plays him as this scary, intimidating predator. And it's really, really brilliant. It's a marvellous performance. Of course, Christopher Lee would go on to play Dracula in a bunch of other Hammer movies. And he was always pretty good as Dracula. He was always really good as Dracula. But this, to me, is his finest work as the character. He is amazing in this. It's a masterclass of horror movie acting. And of course, not only do we have the definitive Dracula with Christopher Lee, we also have the definitive Van Helsing with Peter Cushing, who is just fantastic in this movie. Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee play off each other so well, but even in the scenes where they're not together, like Van Helsing is kept apart for a lot of this. Van Helsing and Dracula are kept apart for a lot of this. Even in those scenes, Van Helsing, he just kind of exudes this kind of authority and this confidence about him, and that's from Peter Cushing. This man is not going to rest until he has fulfilled his mission, until he has stopped Dracula, until he has, destroyed this monster. And when he sees Jonathan Harker in his coffin, it sort of that drive within him to stop Dracula only becomes more, urgent. Only becomes more kind of, it has a real urgency to him. He needs to avenge his friend. He needs to stop this monster. But he never kind of goes mad. He always has that kind of grace and that charm to him. And it's a really excellent story. It's a really excellent performance, much like Christopher Lee's. It's just terrific. One thing, actually, I forgot to mention in the screenplay. One thing that I really like, something that I don't really care for in movies, is when you have kind of big exposition dumps where a character just goes, here, let me explain this thing to you, and then they just explain it in one go, and then they just move on. I don't really like when films do that. I understand the point of exposition, but I like when it's done in a more sort of creative way. And this film, Jimmy Sangster's script, is masterful at delivering exposition in a way that doesn't make it feel like they're just explaining the film to you. Right at the start, we get Jonathan Harker's journal, and we hear, Harker reading it in kind of voiceover narration. That's a really great way of doing it. That really, gets through some of the exposition in a really interesting way. And there's also a bit where Van Helsing is sort of going through his notes on vampirism, and he's recorded them. So he's listening back to his notes on vampirism. So it's sort of, again, it's a way of delivering exposition in a clever way. And I think it really, really works. Cushing always had that wonderful kind of charm to him, and that wonderful kind of sophistication, and that really helps his performance as Van Helsing. I think he's just fantastic in the movie. Some other good actors in this as well. Michael Gough is pretty good as Arthur Holmwood in this. I like actually Holmwood's arc in this, how he kind of goes from being very, very skeptical of Van Helsing to ultimately trusting him. And that, again, that comes through in Peter Cushing's portrayal of Van Helsing. You want to believe him, you want to trust him, you trust this man because of how Peter Cushing plays it. And of course, Michael Gough sees the damage, Arthur Holmwood sees the damage that Dracula does as well, so that also helps him kind of trust Peter Cushing. But I really like that bit in the second act where it's kind of slowly, things are very slowly starting to go wrong for Holmwood, and his family are, being targeted by Dracula. You only see Dracula once in that second act, and there's a big portion in the middle where Dracula's not there, but it never feels like it's dragging. Again, it's a perfectly paced movie. It can have those slow moments in this 82-minute runtime, but then when it needs to get more exciting, it it just makes it more exciting because you've had this kind of slow build up, and you've gotten to know the characters more, so you're more invested in them. I really, really love this film, if you can't tell. Yeah, it's just a really terrific piece of work. I actually think this is the quintessential Hammer film. I think more so than Curse of Frankenstein, this really kind of establishes the formula that Hammer would go for. The kind of the gothic horror movies in bright Technicolor with the very bright, very visceral blood. The quite violent scenes. Obviously, it's quite tame by today's standards, but at the time, very graphic scenes, and kind of the sexual tension and the sexual undertones running throughout. These would all be things that would appear in a lot of future Hammer movies. So yeah, this was really kind of the template for the mold that they would go for, that Hammer would stick with going forward. It still holds up brilliantly well as well, this movie. It looks great. This Blu-ray is fantastic. This actually contains both the BFI restoration from 2007 and the Hammer restoration from 2012. Both really good. But yeah, and it's been remastered in HD beautifully. This film still looks gorgeous. Again, the cinematography and the production design really do help. I think they're two of the strongest aspects of the film. Yeah, it's just such a great film, such a really good horror movie. It gets the essence and the feel of Dracula just down perfectly in a way that I don't think any other Dracula adaptations have quite captured since. This, to me, even though it's not the most faithful adaptation of the novel, when I read the novel, this is kind of how I picture it. This is how I picture everything looking, how I picture the castle looking, how I picture the characters looking, how I picture just the atmosphere that the novel, creates. I think is perfectly captured in this film adaptation. If you haven't seen this version of Dracula, I would strongly urge you to watch this, because it's such a great version. And like I say, it's only 82 minutes, so it flies by, but it doesn't feel rushed, which is brilliant. I don't know how they managed to do that, but it's when you give it to a director as masterful as Terence Fisher. It really, everything just comes together beautifully in this movie. It is, for me, the definitive version of Dracula. I love it. I've seen it multiple times, more than any other Dracula adaptation. And yeah, for me, this is just a perfect Dracula movie. So, there we go, Dracula from 1958. Have you seen the movie? What do you think of it? Let me know in the comments if you feel like it. Thanks so much for stopping by. I'll see you when I see you.